Hello, and welcome to The Issue on the ASGCT Podcast Network. I'm your host, Emily Walsh Martin, and today I'm incredibly lucky to be joined by Dr. Ralph Brandenberger, Master Principal, Head of CMC at Dark Horse Consulting. Today, we're going to talk about a fact of life for every company, program, and asset in the gene and cell therapy space: due diligence. And just like that old saying that gastrulation is the most important time in a person's life, due diligence is the most important time in a company's existence. If successful, it's a prelude to a funding event or a partnership. And regardless, it will set a tone for the relationship moving forward and perhaps cement your team's reputations in the process. Ralph and I have been through oodles of diligences between us, so we'll try to peel back the curtain on what to expect, how to prepare, and how to stay calm, cool, and collected under scrutiny. But first, the ASGCT 2026 annual meeting is coming to Boston. With more than 170 sessions, greater than 750 speakers, and almost 2,000 posters, join us May 11th through the 15th for this premier event in our field. And just a reminder, ASGCT members save big on registration. Check out the full program, plan your trip, and register for the ASGCT annual meeting at annualmeeting.asgct.org. And now the episode. Welcome to The Issue on the ASGCT Podcast Network. Dr. Ralph Brandenberger, how are you today?
Doing fine, thanks. How are you?
Doing well. I'm so glad to have you here today. We're going to try and do a deep dive on diligences, and we're going to take this topic sort of writ large because I think it's very timely. Like, there's a lot of people getting funded and they're going to have to go through diligences, or there's a lot of people trying to fund things and they're going to have to do a diligence. And so what we're going to try and talk about is how to prepare for a diligence, how to survive one, and also how to do one as well. But before we dive into that, I think our audience will very much be curious about your career path. You and I overlapped at UCSF once upon a time, although we weren't in the same laboratory, and I don't know that we ever truly crossed paths. And but then your career has taken you through some amazing organizations, sort of cornerstone organizations, if you will, in our industry, from Geron to Dark Horse Consulting. And could you share a little bit for our listeners about your journey?
Yeah, happy to do so, and to go back to the land before time, so to speak. I'm a scientist by training. I have a PhD in cell biology. I moved from Switzerland originally, and I moved to the US for postdoctoral studies to UCSF, which is where we were sort of overlapping, and did a postdoctoral study in developmental biology. After that, I moved into industry and soon joined sort of the cell therapy field. My first company in the cell therapy area was Geron Corporation, which was the first company with human embryonic stem cell-derived cell therapy IND in the US. I moved from sort of functional genomics bioinformatics role into a development role there, which is sort of happened by accident. But I found that the development space is really what I really love to do, which is to, a directed path is you need to achieve X. What's the path to get there as opposed to the open questions in science? That really suited me. So I spent 12 years at Geron Corporation. After that, I moved into the biologics manufacturing space for 4 years, doing large-scale monoclonal antibody production and recombinant protein production, cell banking, before moving back again into cell therapy. Joined a company called Neurona, working on pluripotent stem cells for neuronal disease epilepsy. And then after that, joined the company called Nkarta, which is natural killer cells, CAR NK cells. Built up the whole CMC function there, joined very early on, and built up the whole what's called CMC, chemistry, manufacturing, and control function, including process development, analytical development, manufacturing, and quality. And ended up as chief technical officer at that company. So it's really sort of covered early stage companies, getting products into the clinic and preparing for later stage. And most recently now I've joined a company called Dark Horse Consulting, which is sort of a premier consulting company in the cell and gene therapy space. And I cover all kinds of aspects in CMC, including due diligences.
Absolutely. And that's a perfect segue for us to sort of dive in here. And, due diligence is perhaps for some of our listeners will be kind of an unknown term, for instance, if they're coming straight from academia. And for others, it may be a very well-known term that fills their hearts with dread. So, but I think from all of our interactions, the one thing that I think is true for the both of us is that I think we weirdly enjoy due diligences, and I hope that our infectious enthusiasm can encourage other people to see the silver lining in a due diligence, and because it's a fact of life. It'd be great for you to talk a little bit about your experiences with due diligences, maybe because I expect these may even go back to your Geron days.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of these things where I wish I would have known earlier what that means. Is my first due diligence experience is about 10 years into that. And you're right, it was at Geron Corporation because at some point the company decided to sell off the cell therapy asset. And so I was involved in that due diligence of preparing that and being part of that when, talking to prospective partners now. I played a technical role at that time, but that was really sort of the first exposure, and it sort of hits you like a train when that comes, right? So similar to the project we worked on together is Geron hired an expert in due diligence to put this stuff together, and suddenly there's somebody coming in and said, we need all these things. Here are lists of documents we need, and there's this tracking. This is the first draft of the document. Has it been reviewed? Has it gone to the client? Has the client reviewed? Are there comments back? And it moves really, really fast and goes very, very deep in multiple areas. That was sort of that first one. And to your point is, due diligence are an integral part of the biotech industry. You do it many, many times. And so I think it's actually much better if you know how that works early on, because in your career, you're going to be exposed to the due diligences at some point in your career.
Absolutely. And I think, it's one of those things where when you get it right, when you have sort of a successful due diligence, it ends up inspiring confidence at both sides, both the sell side, if you will, and the buy side, because it does sort of set how you perform in those due diligences set the tone for what might be a partnership afterwards, right? Because a lot of times a due diligence is ahead of doing some sort of, co-development partnership, or it can be ahead of an investment decision, right? And so in either case, it's really a partnership after that. And so certainly I've been on both sides of diligences, as have you. And I think the other thing that is challenging a lot for due diligences, particularly just where we are as an industry in cell and gene therapy, is that usually these diligences are happening when they're a ton of unknowns still about a program, because maybe the clinical work is just getting started, or maybe you haven't even filed that IND. And so when you're thinking about these early stage programs, and when you're on the side of the diligizer, so the one doing the diligence, looking at these e-rooms filled with data from, someone who's hoping for a partnership or hoping for an investment, what are you thinking about when you look through that e-room filled with oodles of documents?
Yeah, I think one of the primary pieces of it is really risk mitigation and understanding, right? This is to understand what are the risks involved. Is there anything hidden that's not obvious up front? Is the value that's being presented what it is? That's a lot of time what you need to look at. Is this a real asset? What's the value behind it? Do you agree with what's there? And understand what you get yourself into. What are the risks you need to mitigate going forward, and is the value really confirmed by this? And so that's sort of the key to it.
Absolutely. So and oftentimes, just thinking back, oftentimes you're presented with, let's say, a target product profile of, okay, here's this product, and let's imagine it's a cell therapy that's meant to do X, Y, and Z, and here's the patient population we think it can get into. Here's what we think will be the sort of safety profile in the clinic, and so forth. But a lot of times, at the time we're doing these diligences, maybe they don't even have the IND enabling toxicology studies back yet. So a lot of this is somewhat vaporware. So when when you're in the room, how do you balance that? Oh my God, there's so many unknowns here. With the yes, and there might be something quite interesting out the other side.
You're right. In particular for early companies, is sort of the fuzziness is bigger, right? So it's less determined. There's more gray space, and so I think it comes down to certainly to experience you have in the space. You've been there, done that before in similar fashion. That helps you understand, well, this is what the potential trajectories are. Oftentimes it goes back to me too with earlier investors are oftentimes willing to take more risks. They're looking for huge, bigger returns, but they're willing to accept more risks, right? So it's also very stage dependent and phase dependent what that is. But I think it comes down to experience you've seen before and you've had before to assess, because there is substantial fuzziness around it.
Yeah, and I think when I'm doing those diligences, the one thing I think about, and it sounds like you do too, is first of all, what's my experience? Tell me, something with this profile is likely to how it's likely to perform. But then secondarily, who's on the actual team, right, at that company, and what has their experience been, and how, have they worked on any of the, comparator products for the asset that's undergoing diligence. And so there's a lot of that too. But a lot of times I don't know the people at that company. And so I'm curious if you've experienced that, and sort of how do you get a sense that the people sort of who fed all this, love and sweat into this e-room are the sort of right people to continue to progress an asset forward?
I've been sort of on both sides of this. In fact, one of the due diligence where we were being diligenced is
Mm-hmm.
is I was actually specifically kept on the team as to be part of the package that goes to the new company, because my experience was supposed, I had been deeply involved with that asset for years, right, in that
Right.
technology, and so where I was really ingrained in this, and so I think that's. On the other hand, then if you're the diligencer, you need to look at that and understand and really try to get into contact with the people, and which sometimes is hard. In particular, if it's external due diligence, you may not get unfettered access to them, right? So you have to.
Right.
But it is key. Oftentimes, in particular for early companies, the people are the key. It's like, because they have the experience, they've been with this program for a long time, and so it becomes essential to understand what the people on the team are. Yeah, it's almost like an
Yeah.
interview process, but it's almost you have to really get that feel of how deeply ingrained they are, how committed they are with the program, because they become key with moving the asset forward.
Absolutely. I think, something you just said sort of, it's funny, it sort of triggered for me maybe something I was unaware of that I was doing. So oftentimes when I do, a due diligence, let's say for an investment decision, a VC has hired me, they've brought me in, there's an e-room that's open that perhaps the VC is, taken a first pass through it, but I'm sort of the one doing the super deep dive. And usually where I start, I have like this layout to my ultimate report that I just start plowing through, and usually it has a section on the team, and sort of, and I don't even get to fill that out at the beginning usually, because I don't know enough about the people. And what I find I learn the most about the people from is my first set of queries. So like I'll get into the room, I'll write up, 20 questions that I have based on what I'm seeing or what I think I might be missing from the data set that's being presented. And when that set of questions comes back sort of filled out by the team, then I start to understand a little more about what their experience would be, where's their point of view coming from. Has that been your experience as well? That in some ways it's that forced interaction through queries that sometimes becomes the way you learn who someone is.
Yeah, absolutely. It is when you have those conversations, you see the depth of their expertise, right? A resume
Yeah.
or a CV just gives you something, but is the depth and the knowledge there comes from those actual conversations. I think that's a very, very good way to start that. Yeah.
And so a lot of times, and I will say, I've been on a ton of diligences. I expect probably you have as well. But like sometimes the questions come back and the person clearly feels like this is a waste of their time indulging your questions. And I will say that I try very much to ignore that tone if I perceive it in the responses, but it's hard. And what I think what I love the most is when someone comes back and says, I'm guessing why you're asking that question, and I'm guessing it's this reason. Here's why I think there's a different perspective here, and sort of reframes my question into the question maybe they wanted to answer in the first place. And it's interesting when I find that when teams take that extra sort of deep breath, even if they feel put upon by my questions, and reframe even if they don't give me my direct answer, that I instinctually sort of have more confidence in them. I don't know if you've seen similar.
Again, I agree. It's really interesting, actually. In fact, what you sort of walk through is almost not specifically related to diligence. I don't need to veer away too far, but
Yeah.
what you're describing is sort of is active listening, right? Is somebody
Yeah.
who active listening to what you say, and that results in more engaging conversations, right? Yeah, and sometimes the people on the due diligence, they're stressed. There might be multiple partners that come along, and you get questions from everywhere, and they're still trying to do a job, and so it's hard for them. But
Right.
taking that little bit of time, actively listening and understanding where the question's coming from really helps the conversation. I think that's a very good thing to do, not just in regular interactions, but just from due diligence perspective, right? This that allows for better communication, better understanding. But this is a very general theme. Active listening is a very, very important skill.
Absolutely. And right. It's one of those things that I think we're probably taught in kindergarten, and yet it's still like, still like the core to, I think, or the cornerstone of good drug development. So maybe let's talk a little bit about the sort of flip side. So instead of, being the one walking into a populated e-room, like let's talk a little bit about how we prepare for a diligence. What are the best practices that you've seen for starting to populate that e-room so that you can undergo scrutiny?
Yeah, so most diligences that I've been involved with, really start with the diligencer providing a document request list and say, this is what we want to know. And so, that on the receiving end, then it's very important to take that list and make sure you track it carefully. You're having multiple people pulling lists together, putting documents together. Everything needs to be vetted. My experience has also been is that typically there's sort of a tier of documents. You do something that's the most important ones to work with first. That's what
Hmm.
the diligencer wants to see first. And then you have more in-depth. Everything runs on a tight schedule, right? So you need to be really good at prioritizing. We've got lists of 300 documents that you need to turn around, and they want them in 24 hours or as quick as possible. So it's very important to triage, be very structured about it. You categorize them into priorities, and then make sure that everything that goes out to the client has been reviewed.
Right.
So I think those are pieces that are important.
Yeah, and I think, if you're lucky too, right? let's imagine it's a pre-IND, so the IND hasn't been filed, right? So it's like that's frankly in my mind the worst stage for diligence because you're still actively working on all the documents that have to go to the FDA, right? You're still actively reviewing data coming back from a tox study and understanding it for yourself before you try to present it to others. And so I think it's important to be cognizant of that. But I also think in some ways there's a list of documents that everyone wants to see. Like there's a core list that you can already imagine. So if you know that, 2 months from now you want to have an open e-room, like you could probably make a first pass list with priority first before you even receive a list from the diligizer, if you will, in advance. And I think it's important that anything you already know is going to need a conversation for the person doing diligence to actually understand it. Like earmark that and figure out a way to, if you can, have that conversation before you populate it into the e-room, walk them through a deck, and then say, here you go. Like it's important not to seem like you're trying to hide any data or prevent the actual diligence, but at the same time, our data can be quite complicated, and so you have to do some
Yeah,
talking.
that's a very good point. Is these very early companies, it's not just that there are reports you can put in, right? Well-written reports that maybe have been even sent to or have been reviewed by regulators. And one of the worst things you can do is not to provide them. To
Yeah.
your point, right? And so exactly. So if it's something where there's not a report or something where the data may be open to interpretation or you don't have all the results, I think that approach of you need to have a conversation rather than just sending something over is important. And I think that's appreciated by the diligencer too, because these things are complicated and difficult to understand sometimes. And so getting the right context probably helps the diligencer too. But if it looks like you're hiding something, that usually elicits a certain response. Right? So similar to when you're talking to a regulator, right? That's not going to help you with it. So yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I guess I'm curious if you had any sort of bright sides in your career where you've either gone through a diligence as the diligencer or the diligentee, where you've seen teams actually like really benefit and advance their asset because of the diligence. I'd love to hear those kinds of stories.
Yeah, I do. I think, I've actually been recently been involved in one where the investors wanted to acquire an asset, and that was successful. So we did the due diligence on this, and the asset was in good shape. And what's interesting to what I thought about when I was thinking about this podcast is, this due diligence package turns into a starting point for what comes afterwards. And
Mm,
so that what was put together during the due diligence was a very structured, informative package that then was the starting point for that newly formed company to take this process and move it forward. And it started with this very, very well structured, comprehensive set of information that was vetted, that
yeah.
was reviewed, and therefore was allowed that new company then to move forward fairly quickly. I think it's an interesting thing. It's like this is your starting point, and the better set up you are, the faster you can move afterwards.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's funny because I've had that almost exact same experience. I came into a company after they brought in an asset, and as part of bringing in the asset, they had a report just like you're talking about, and that report became their IDP, their integrated development plan. And so I think all the program team had to do once the asset landed was actually start to put quotes for the actual work and timelines for study start dates and that kind of thing into that IDP or proto ITP, and it became sort of the plan for this asset as it went through IND enablement. And that's like a huge benefit.
Yeah,
And that's
absolutely.
kind of the
Yeah.
goal. Like as the person who's being having diligence done on them, like you want the outcome to be something like that, because that means your program has been vetted enough to know where the risks are, to your point, and also know where the big question marks are, such that if a development plan can come out the other side of a diligence, then I think both parties get value from that.
I've had sort of not the opposite, but in one of the diligences, the outcome was that there was no investment made because the asset wasn't evaluated to be ready or for that stage, and it provided a roadmap for what needs to get done. It highlighted the gaps, it highlighted the risks that, oh yeah, these are things that are important. And so it was actually instructive for the company to say, okay, yeah, these are things we need to focus on. And
Right.
that way improved the projects as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, to your point, regardless, my goal whenever I'm, doing a diligence report for a VC is, first of all, I try to write the report so the VC can hand that to the company afterwards. So it's written in such a manner that my conclusions and my what I reviewed is very well documented, so that they can know what I keyed in on, and can understand why I came to the decisions or conclusions that I did. And then to your point, it does give them sort of a roadmap of, okay, well, if these are seen as the biggest risks, let's fix those first.
That is, what you're describing is a really, really positive thing because due diligence is a stressful piece, and if at the end, if it doesn't work, then it's very good to understand why. It's because it's not because everything's bad, but here are some risks that we weren't able to evaluate properly, or we thought the risks were different, and so it becomes constructive rather than to say, "Oh, we're done with this. We don't want this." And
Right.
so that's a very good output to have.
Yeah. And I think the other thing is just for, being in the shoes of having the diligence done. You're right. It's super challenging. It is tough to have someone go through all your things and not know what's in their head, right? And I think that for me, you almost have to be in a mental state, and the way I sort of frame this usually for my teams when we're about to prep for a diligence is, reasonable people with the same information will come to similar conclusions. And that may not mean a decision to invest, for instance, but at least, if we provide the information, get everything out on the table, and then have reasoned conversations with active listening, at least we'll all agree what is here and what's not here, at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I've had sort of positive experiences from this too. Is you get in particular when you talk with your, actually in most cases due diligence, the diligence team comes in with experts in that area.
Mm-hmm.
And those can be very interesting conversations to have when you bring an expert in the particular, in each area that an expert comes in to look at what you have, and so you can in fact really learn from that. And in most cases it's something of trying to learn and understand, and these are productive discussion, and so it's actually it's in fact really interesting.
Yeah. So I mean, I think our message to everyone who's, maybe just been told by their management that an e-room must be constructed by the end of the quarter, stay calm. Think through, what data would you want to see, if it was your money on the line, and pull that together, and the areas that you worry about being shaggy, be clear about those, be transparent, and who knows, maybe the person doing diligence on the other side will have great ideas to help you
Yeah.
fix it
Yeah.
up.
Yeah, it's much better. Everybody has skeletons in their closet. It doesn't matter, like everybody does. And so
Yeah.
it's much better if you figure out a way how to position that and show that to the diligence team rather than they start pulling threads and start finding it, right?
Yeah.
You're going to have a more productive conversation if you show this rather than if they're going, well, what is this?
Right.
So
Yeah. No, I will say this, like, if you're the person finding something, that hasn't been sort of explicitly called out, and let's say it's a big risk, and if like the first reaction by the team is not, yes, we meant to make that clear. Here's X, Y, and Z. Here's the follow-up data you're probably looking for, blah, blah, blah. Like if that's not the interaction, then as the diligizer, it's really tough for me not to think, okay, what else have I missed? Now I've got to double click on everything. And so you
Absolutely.
don't want to get anyone into that point of view, because that's when a diligence sort of turns very more complicated for you.
Absolutely.
I'm just curious because you, in your career, have obviously played a range of roles, from sort of chief technology officer to CMC to development lead. And so when you are entering a diligence room, what hat do you have on? Or do you sort of wear that integrated hat first? Or like, just what's your trends and tendencies?
Oh, it really depends on what the purpose of the diligence is. Because
Mm,
the diligence I've been involved with could be a really early stage asset that isn't even in the clinic, as well as something where it's a late stage investment, of a prior to a BLA into a manufacturing facility. Should
right.
we invest in this? And so it really depends on the scope. And so I think that is a key thing to me too, as part of a diligence is to really understand what's the question that's being asked, and really clarify that. It's like if you don't have the right question that to ask, is you're not going to get good answers. And so really, it really depends on what it is. But really, get clarity of what you're looking at, and then look at that specifically. And I do like, though, on the other hand, try to get an overview what's in the data room, even if it's hundreds of documents. You
Right.
know, and I do tend to just poke around a little bit to see what kind of documents are there, just to get the lay of the land, but then really try to focus on these are the specific questions we need to get answers to.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I think when I dive in, I'm trying to think. The first thing, so let's say it's an IND stage asset, like the first thing I'll look at is the investigator brochure because I feel like that usually lays out the big picture, the concerns, et cetera, and enough about the sort of key preclinical data that I know sort of where to sort of tiptoe through the rest of the
Yeah,
files.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
yeah.
Another place I go to with IND stage assets is to go through the actual FDA communications.
Yes.
What questions did the FDA ask about this, right? Because you submit an IND, you may have approval, but what were the conversations that the FDA had, and what were the non-hold comments that they wanted to ask, for example, right? At each stage, at an interact stage, or at the actual IND meeting, or any type C or other meetings that you have. That's often very informative what the regulators thought.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the other thing I try to do, and it's sometimes quite difficult, is to try and understand, what data was present. And obviously you can go through the briefing books, but sometimes those are hundreds of pages long. Like what data was present when the FDA was making those comments, and sort of can I jump ahead to see, have you already addressed it? And oftentimes those will be my first questions, back to the team to say, okay, I noticed this set of questions from the FDA. I expect you've probably already begun or have already answered them, but like, can you point me to that,
Yeah, yeah,
just to make
yeah.
sure I'm tracking?
Which is, to your earlier point, right? It's very difficult if it's an earlier stage asset. If it's an IND stage asset, you have this formal documentation. Even if for pre-IND or interact meetings, there's a briefing book that you can
Right.
go look, and it has this is the information. But if it's before that, you typically work with companies that haven't had that interaction at the very early stage, and so it becomes much less structured and somewhat harder to evaluate, and also harder to put together for a data room.
Right, right. And it's funny for a while there, just the kinds of diligences that I was on, I was keeping for myself like a table of other publicly available INDs out there and sort of what data they had and when, so that I could at least create some sort of comparator in my own mind of, okay, here's this new asset. It hasn't yet gone through IND enabling studies. What's that, shape of the studies likely to look like based on everything that's come before? But you do end up having to do that kind of comparison on those really, really early stage companies in order to ground yourself, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. So I think we've done enough diligence on diligence, which allows me to bring you to my final question, which is my favorite question, which is if you could wave a wand and fix one thing for cell and gene therapy development, what would it be?
Now, this is not in the context of due diligence. Is it
You
the
get a
one big
free,
question?
you get a magic wand to do anything you want at this point.
So I'll stick sort of to the CMC type realm, because one of the things that is a pet peeve of mine and is a real struggle when you think about developing a cell therapy forward is there is this tension or conflict between what investors want and what's best for the long term of the product. And investors realize that it's not, investors are smart. They're all smart, but an early investor typically looks for a clinical readout. They want the phase one data to understand if there's something there. So it's either entry to the clinic is their value inflection point, or the early clinical data. Cell therapies in particular, and gene therapies too, are very difficult to develop. And in the allogeneic space in particular, scalability is a problem. Putting together a manufacturing process that is commercially viable takes a long time. And so that needs time, which is what the early investors don't really want. They want the clinical data as quick as possible. And that means you're developing a process that's suitable for phase one. You can get into the clinic, you can get that data, but it's not suitable, or there's challenges for after that. And so the late stage investors that come in, we need to get to the BLA as quickly as possible. And so you have this struggle, and I think if there's one thing that I would like to get or have, is that early investors realize that the true value of the asset is that it's actually commercially viable, and that you need to do that development. That's a big tension.
I love that. Yes, like that should happen. I mean, here's the thing, right? To your point, like if you're under financed at those early stages, you're going to build a good enough for phase one, manufacturing process and release process. Then you're going to get into the clinic and you're maybe going to see some promising results. But most of the times, especially if you're, let's say in the oncology space, right, you might have patients that have different levels of efficacy from those early stage phase one process drugs. And you will never be able to sort out what is that because of the manufacturing process? Do I need it to be more reliable, repeatable, et cetera? Or is it because the patients are just, some are going to respond, some are not going to respond. And so without sort of being able to invest enough to feel like your process is robust enough, it's really hard to answer those questions at phase one. And then you end up answering them at much greater cost in phase two, phase three studies. And maybe with a huge amount of risk, because you're going to make assumptions about which batches were the good batches in quotations, and if you're wrong about that, that's a very, very, very expensive phase 2-3 mistake.
Yeah. And it is a very difficult problem to solve, because cell therapy development, it is expensive. It is complicated and expensive. And so large amounts of money before you even have clinical data is usually a challenge. So it's a very difficult balance to strike.
Absolutely. No, it's a huge challenge, but I like the idea of let's wave that wand and grant some people some more cash early on. Only for the CMC team. Well, thank you so, so much, Dr. Ralph Brandenberger, for joining us today. Really, really appreciate all your insights on diligence, and I'm hoping for your magic wand to come through.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me on the podcast.